Hello, hello. Happy afternoon. Welcome. I'm sure people will be hopping on at some point. Um, I personally am very excited about today, and I know this I say that every week, but this is my favorite topic that we've done so far, and it is around people costs. Because I am such a nerd when it comes to managing a team and handling your people. So I'm just gonna get
Right.
that
You
out.
love people. You love people. You love management. You love managing people. It's like your
I'm
perfect
I
combo.
know, I'm one of those weird ones. Um I had a conversation the other day when someone was saying something like, "I know it's not everyone's favorite topic." I was like, "It is my favorite topic."
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, so don't worry for everybody watching. Like that's Rachel, and then there's me. And I'm not saying I don't like managing people. I'm not saying I don't like people. I'm just not gonna say anything.
Yeah, Colin's just gonna be out. He's gonna be silent the rest of this live stream.
That's right.
Okay, but yeah, so we were talking about people costs today, which is, I mean, come on, for most businesses, this is their biggest line item. So huge impact on profitability. If you have outsized people costs, that means that, I mean, it's hard to be profitable when you have a lot of people costs. If you have dialed it in, it can have a huge impact.
Yeah, it's a superpower if you get it right, and it's
Yep.
like a fatal flaw if you get it wrong. I mean, it cuts really hard both ways for
Yep.
sure.
And so we're finance people, right? So we're going to talk about these three financially related people breakthroughs in today's live stream. And these are the questions that we get asked from clients, from anyone who's like, I feel like I'm spending too much on people. This is what we tell them. This is the approach that we have. Our hope for you by the end of this live stream is that you will never look at your team the same after these three breakthroughs. Be like, wow, why didn't I think of that before? Is our
Yeah.
hope for you.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So we're coming at it from a different angle. Everybody
yeah.
knows, everybody's managed team and everybody knows, and there's 1,000 books you can go get on how to manage your team, et cetera. But yes, to your point, if we do this well, you will never look at your team the same way after this.
Mm-hmm. So normally what we do is we go through our three breakthroughs, whatever we want to call them, and then we do Q&A at the end. We are unfortunately running tight on time today. So I think we're going to have to skip the Q&A, and if you have questions throughout, we'll try and answer them. Otherwise, we'll answer them in next week's Q&A or just in
Yep.
the comments. So feel free to keep asking questions. We'll get to
Absolutely.
them. Um, okay, so people, can be a delicate subject. I wonder, Colin, do you have any notes about how this has shown up for you, or like how being able to handle your people effectively has what your experience has been in the past with your several businesses?
Yeah. So people management is a different thing depending on the size of the company, the maturity of the company, like where you're at in that journey. But I tell people this is one of the most common ceilings that businesses and business owners, especially, kind of grow into, and then they hit the ceiling and they have to figure it out or they can't ever break through. And that ceiling is based around the idea that, like, when you're a really small company, or like when I took over my first company and we had to do an aggressive turnaround, and it was like super command and control. And what I mean by that is, you're that person in the middle with 10 helpers. It's like, I need you to go do this next and then come back. I need you to go do this and then tell me when you're done. And you kind of live in that mode out of desperation. And I think a lot of business owners, when they're hiring their first employee or two, like, they have the whole picture in their mind. And so whether they're, blunt about it or really polite and sweet about it with a lot of pleases and thank yous, it still functions in that same way. And it's not until you learn to grow beyond that style of management and attract talent who can operate beyond that and work together with them. It's not until you've crossed that threshold that your company can really take off and hit the next levels. And so for me personally, when we came through the turnaround, as we started to actually figure some things out, I started hitting the ceiling and I couldn't quite figure out why. And as I look back, it wasn't until I learned these three things we're going to talk about today and how to look at my business and my team differently and got them on that same page. It wasn't until those things happened that we broke through. And once we did, we broke through. And I just want to tell for everybody who's on the call, like there's no limit to how far you can take this. If you use these, again, this is why we said you're going to look at your team differently and you're going to look at how to manage a team within a business differently. And there's no limit to how far you can take it. Like I have companies I don't work at that I don't have a business card for anymore, that I don't talk to a single, team member, a single vendor, customer. Like I'm out of the day-to-day of those businesses because you can scale these concepts we're talking about today up. And so, similar concepts to run a CEO for your company or frontline person. So it's really game-changing kind of thought process. And there's almost no limit to how far you can take it.
That's an amazing journey to come into a business and have to be like the micromanager to where you are now, where you're not, I mean, that those companies manage themselves. You don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. And to be fair, other people manage those companies, right? They don't literally manage themselves. But from my personal, vantage point, yeah, that's basically how it works. And so again, I'm not saying that's everyone's goal. Like we always say, the minute I meet an entrepreneur, the first thing I want to know from you, whether we're friends, I run into you, somebody introduces us, whatever, is like, what are those goals? Because I don't want to push you toward a goal that's not your own. But for some people like me, it's hey, I want to own a business and not be in the day-to-day of it. And so that may seem insurmountable from where you're stuck today, which is I'm in this command and control. Like I'm saying my pleases and thank yous, but I'm still like, everything depends on me. I remember one day, and I'll just tell this quick story. I remember one day I was going to meet my mom for lunch, and I was on a call, like on some sort of a meeting call. And I opened the door to my office, and I was just trying to turn the corner and make it 40 feet to the front door. And I had like 5 people waiting, like, hey, got a second? Hey, I need you. Hey, and I realized I'm like, this is crazy. Beyond it just being frustrating for me, like that's not a way for these employees to live. Like what a crazy scenario that it's one thing to like want to update me on something that could have waited, but to feel this panic that they needed me before I went to lunch so they could continue to operate and function was like, I remember I dealt with them and walked out and I was like, I can't live like this. This is insane. So if you have a hard time taking a vacation, if you have a hard time taking a day off of work, if you have a hard time going to your kid's school function and knowing that everything's going great, and then you're going to come back to a company that's better than where you left it, this is for you.
Yes, that is what we want for you.
Absolutely.
I mean, really what it comes down to is that if you don't know the numbers behind your labor, like you can't run a successful business. You just can't. Like you have to know where all of that money is being spent and that it's being spent in the right ways and that you can trust your team to handle it in order to have a solid business.
Yep.
So, okay, let's start off with breakthrough number 1. Breakthrough number 1 is cultures that embrace productivity annihilate the competition. Productivity and efficiency should be your number 1 goal for your company.
Yes.
And we don't say that in a way like you have to be on top of them at all times and say like, what are you doing? Are you being productive? No.
Yep.
So we want to dispel that right away, is that we're not trying to be big brother here. We're trying to get the team to be productive on their own.
Yes. And for them to understand productivity, appreciate it for what it is, and ultimately get better at it than they would be if you were telling them what to do. Like that's when it's really working. And yet, if you were telling them what to do, they're generally not going to be happy. And if they're doing it, they have the fulfillment, they have the pride that comes, they have the sense of ownership around what they're doing that every manager dreams their team to have. And so it's like the ultimate. Yeah. And so I love that. I know EOS says culture eats strategy for breakfast or something. It has some culture is better than strategy, basically, is one of the EOS imperative concepts. And that's what we're saying here is a culture of productivity. So I don't want just, oh, everybody loves each other. This is such a positive team. Everybody's, enjoys going out to lunch together and we don't get anything done. Obviously that's not the goal, but we also don't want you to have to feel like a tyrant micromanaging the team over the finish line.
Yeah.
And I've lived in that, and that is a miserable existence for everyone. And it really is. And I feel like my team gave me enough credit for like, I was trying to help us all. But when I look back, it was just, I was inexperienced. I didn't know what I was doing. And so we get it into the culture. That's why we're using the word culture here. If the culture embraces productivity, not the manager, not the owner, not a handful of key employees, but if the culture embraces productivity, then you will annihilate the competition, because as we know, most companies aren't like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So how does this work in the real world? One of them is you need to have a very engaged team. And so think about encouraging your whole team to understand that what they should be working on is the best use of their time. Everything they should be doing, they should be thinking all the time about, is this the best use of my time? And that dials down to two things. Like what is the best, for example? That is what moves the company forward. And we'll talk about that in terms of I'll give you a sneak preview, our critical unit. But what moves the company forward and what is within their unique ability? What are they naturally good at? And that brings them energy.
Yep.
So those two things.
Yeah. And I would say, like, if anybody who's watching this, you're an entrepreneur, like that's one of the reasons people are drawn to entrepreneurship is generally like, I want to work on the things I want to work on. I want to really feel like the pride and fulfillment. And we forget that that's what everyone wants. Yeah. And so remembering that like a well-run team is putting team members in a position to shine, right? Mm-hmm. And not just saying like, I value this one over that one because they grind harder. That's nonsense. That's not the right way to do it. It's not sustainable. Even if you can do it for a short period of time and get some really high results, it's in no way sustainable. And so, yes, I love that. And like we talk about this in Strategic Coach, they talk about, what is people's unique ability? And so your unique ability is something that you're unnaturally gifted at. And your unique ability is something that you never tire of thinking about it, learning about it, and working on it. And so if you kind of think about it, and if you had every employee working the maximum amount of time in their unique ability, your company is going to be amazing. And culture will take care of itself, and productivity will take care of itself.
Mm-hmm. You need to have this shift from focusing on, is everyone busy? That's not what you should be measuring.
Yep.
You need to shift your thought from focusing on busy to focusing on being productive. So, for example, like, hey, if someone is being really productive and they're doing all the things that they need to do, and then they take like an hour break to chit chat, I don't care. They're getting
not at all. No, we celebrate that. We celebrate the ability to do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, that's a great point, because people who own their area, people who have taken that level of ownership and pride in what they're doing and they're engaged, like they're doing more than we would have asked them to do if we were the one picking the goal line. So if they can get that done and have a positive, enjoyable kind of pace and style about it, that's the dream. That's really the dream. So yeah, I think that's huge. And like you said, we do things like we'll have an activity inventory, which is where you're writing down the things you're actually working on. But we're not doing that to say like, prove to me your value or show. We're doing it to help people prioritize the most valuable things they should be spending their time on, and answer the question like, hey, I might be doing this thing. It's really important, but I hate it. I hate everything about it. Okay. Like we need to get to the bottom of that. We need to figure out how we're going to do that differently. So yeah, I think that is a huge element of engagement. And if your team really believes that you're trying to help them accomplish that, so much of everything else we're going to talk about today smooths out amazingly.
Yes, it does. So I hinted at this before, but Colin, can you touch on this concept of the critical unit and how we use that to engage our team?
Yeah. So the critical unit is just understanding your business. So this applies across all areas of business, but it's especially impactful when we're talking about the labor efficiency. And that is like a critical unit. So the easiest example, one of my businesses is a cabinet business. It's how many cabinets, right? So we're not just talking about, what is some form of productivity in terms of like this micro version of their job. Like if it's the way the inventory is stored or whatever those things are, you can get so micro that you lose sight of like the big goal of the game, right? And so like in sports, which we'll talk about sports here in a minute, but if we're taking it to something that's really obvious, everybody knows, the critical unit in sports is the score. Period. Doesn't matter how many yards you got, how many interceptions you threw, doesn't matter any of the other stats that may be good stats or bad stats. The ultimate measure is what the score is. And so for your business, I would just encourage every business to think about what is that ultimate unit. And so we call it the critical unit. And to the extent you can figure that out, and now your team is engaged, you now point to that and say, look, I'm not trying to micromanage you. I'm trying to get us to go move that needle, us to go score more points than the other teams, and then we win.
And it's important to try and find a critical unit that isn't money related. So it's not like revenue is your critical unit, because that's oftentimes not all that motivating to your team. It's like, oh, cool, I made the company more money. But if you can say, we made this many cabinets in your example, and last week we made 500 cabinets, and this week we're making 510 cabinets. Like everyone can see that 510 more than 500, that's good.
Yes.
And that's what they can control. They can't control what you're selling the cabinets for, but they can control the number.
Yes. No, I love that. That's a really fantastic point for everybody to hear that. It should not have a dollar sign on that number. That's the kind of weakest, easiest one to go grab. And even if you're sharing numbers within your company, which we love to see, we feel like that's a sign of a mature business and a mature team. But whether you are at that stage or not, exactly what you said, people need to hear this. It is not as motivating for your team to see a dollar sign associated. It should be a work unit, right? It should be a sign of like productivity, something that the company sells, something that it's a clear indicator. If we do a lot of this, we win. If we don't do enough of it, we lose. And so that's the way to kind of set it up and avoid the dollar sign trap, because that one can be, maybe in the short term it works and it becomes very demotivating over time. And the implication becomes like, well, I'm just toiling away to make the company more money, instead of we set a new record on cabinets this week. Like everybody's high-fiving, like that's amazing. That's what we want to see as a company.
Yes. And okay, so the last point I'll make, or things that you should consider when you're thinking about team efficiency, is that you got to be using technology. You got to be using automation. There are so many tools out there right now. This is like the best time in the history of work so far for automation and tools, because anything that you can do that lifts your team members' hands off the keyboard, allows them to think, it's just pure productivity. So things like calendar automations, things like ChatGPT, whatever you can do to allow your team to focus on their unique ability that technology can and never will take over, you should be doing that.
Yep.
You might be thinking, well, how do I know if my team is efficient? So there's one thing that we recommend that you measure, and that is something per labor dollar. So that can look like revenue per labor dollar. That can look like profit per labor dollar. But what we recommend is gross margin per labor dollar. And that is because that's just, it's more relevant to really what efficiency is.
Yep, absolutely. And you can get lost in the shuffle on revenue. So that's why we always say, like, focus your energy on gross margin if you can, and certainly look at labor dollars, not just number of people, because you can get into this trap we'll talk about in a minute where you're paying a lot per person. And so like, oh, well, I still only have 8 people, but now you're paying those 8 people a ton of money. And so again, not saying we don't want to value our team, but you have to be really cautious with just trying to do like total number of people.
Yep. All right. So, I mean, the big benefit of tracking your efficiency is that it helps helps you weather the roller coaster of your revenue. So if you have more efficiency in your team, it means you have less people. It means it helps you as you grow, more of that goes to profit. Or if your revenue starts taking a dip, it means that you're protecting the profit that you have. And that really leads us right into breakthrough number 2. And that is labor is just along for the ride on the revenue roller coaster. What
That's
does that
right.
mean, Colin?
Yeah, and we won't spend too much time on this one. I know we're a little bit tight, but basically you need to understand the style of revenue that you have. We've talked about this before when we talked about revenue. Some businesses are recurring revenue, some businesses are project based, and so they've got like this really kind of wild. And so I kind of jokingly say like revenue is that roller coaster, your labor is the people along for the ride. You need to know, like, when you're approaching your labor, if you have a lot of volatility, a lot of ups and downs, like you need to think about, like, can you afford those downs? Can you handle the ups? Can you afford the downs? How do you build the right labor around that? And hey, it's just a kiddie roller coaster if you're doing like, a recurring revenue or a business that's incredibly stable. You have long contracts, everything's predictable. You can build in a lot easier environment, but you just need to be really, really aware of that when you're building your labor strategy.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we see all the time is like you have really intense growth goals for Q2, for example. You're like, okay, I have to hire to prepare myself for that growth in Q2. Well, that is tricky for 2 reasons. One, that if that revenue doesn't come through, now you have increased labor costs, lowered revenue, no good, lessen the
Yep.
way of profit. The other thing, though, is that a lot of times people don't think about is as soon as you hire that additional person, your profit takes a dip. And so as close as you can get to the revenue growth is where you should be hiring, because if you hire a month ahead of time, that means that for that entire month, your profit is less than it should or it could have been otherwise.
Yeah. And as we talked about, if you have your critical unit understood by your team, which is why we presented that one first, getting everyone kind of, understanding that, then it really becomes like, well, if we're going to bring on somebody new, they need to get this many additional critical units done. They need to help us with that. And so it starts to engage the team in seeing this game of like, we have to be very efficient for however many people we have, for, whatever amount of work we have. And so, yes, that's how we lead back to and get the team embracing the idea of, having more standard like SOPs and a better training program and things that will, like you said, shorten that onboarding, make people more valuable, more efficient, and that the team starts to own that because they bought into that critical unit.
Yeah. So, okay, science that this is a problem, just very quickly, that you should be tracking your labor costs as a percentage of revenue. They should be following. So if labor costs, your growth in labor costs is outpacing the growth in revenue, this is a problem. The other thing is if your revenue is either stable or going down, what you can see is that your team, even though they're well trained, might be getting less efficient. That's where the labor costs or like the gross profit divided by labor dollars comes in. If your team is suddenly getting less efficient, it might suggest that you're overstaffed. Like there's not enough work to go around.
Yeah. And exactly that point, the team should be aware of that if you've got that critical unit. But like you said, not enough revenue coming in with the same amount of team should mean that my efficiency starts to go down. And I'm thinking, well, I know my team's well trained. I know they're really hard workers, but now the whole team collectively can see that challenge for what it is.
Yep. All right, going on to breakthrough number 3, which is approach your comp like a sports team.
That's right. And Rachel's a huge sports fan, so anybody should talk to her about sports. Ask her all the questions you have about sports. Yeah, get really granular. Yeah, so this one is kind of interesting because sports teams are so public about the way they pay their employees, their team, and what's happening. We all see it. We all have opinions on it, right? If we're sports fans. But one of the things you can learn is that sports teams learn to prioritize certain things over others, and they make trade-offs. And so, I was recently on a podcast talking about this, and I'm here in the DFW area, so I was talking about the Dallas Cowboys, and like they prioritized a very expensive running back a few years ago, and that meant that we had to ship off a very expensive wide receiver, and the running back didn't perform to the level needed. So now the entire team's performance comes down. We made a trade-off. They structured it in a certain way they thought was the right way to look at it. And so what you learn, though, is that sports teams prioritize certain things. They kind of have a salary cap for the whole team they can afford. And that's what you're talking about, is like knowing what that percentage of revenue should be.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have a salary cap for everybody. Then I can start thinking about those trade-offs and the way the departments are broken down and kind of start to get it down into a lower level of detail. And that's what you see sports teams do every offseason. We see it happen. And so it's a great reminder. Hopefully this is one of those breakthroughs that are just a different way for people to think about their team. Is like, if you think of it like a sports team, they know they have to make these changes. The salary cap forces them. They don't have a choice. So it forces them into thinking like, okay, what trade-offs am I going to have to make as things go forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And talk a little bit. I know, so unfortunately we have like a hard cutoff for ourselves today. And I feel like we should do more live streams specifically on this topic. But talk about, you have this concept of how to think about market rates and how your team should compare to market rates.
Yeah. So, the big thing that I always think about is, if you have a market rate for a team member, let's just say you've got a frontline customer service person and you've got a market rate, you kind of understand like what that type of market would pay. If you've got a great person that's been on the team for a number of years, you think they're amazing, you trust them, you want to pay a premium for that person, that's okay. However, you need to be making a trade with another position, like we just talked about, structuring your salary cap correctly. So thinking about those trade-offs, but you also cannot charge or pay that person more as a market rate than you're able to charge the market as a premium on your pricing. So let me say that again. If I'm going to pay that person 20% above market to be my frontline customer service person, I should be able to charge 20% more to my customers than my competitors can. And it forces me to say, like, is that frontline customer service person giving such a wow experience? Are my customers valuing it so heavily that they'll pay me extra? And if yes, then we win. And if no, it forces me back into that disconnect and saying, I either can make a trade-off or I can't. And then I have to make, a different way to approach this.
Yeah. That's so, I mean, I've never heard anyone talk about that before, but it's such a great concept that if you're paying a premium, that means that you should be charging a premium.
Yes. Yeah, because the other alternative, right, is what's paying for it? What's paying for it if you aren't? There you go. What's paying for it if you aren't is your profits. Either your customer pays for it or your profits pay for it. And as we say, we cannot ever advocate dipping into profits, because profits are what fuel the health of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Or it ties back to our point number one around efficiency, where if you have a really efficient team, then you can afford to pay all of your people a little bit above rate because your overall labor costs are lower. It's amazing how they all tie together.
It is.
So, okay, to wrap up here, we've got, and I don't think I mentioned this before, but I feel like a lot of people might be asking themselves, like, well, how do I manage to these efficient results? How do I keep these people engaged? And we actually have a tool that we use on our team to measure our team's productivity. We're happy to share that if it's interesting. Like, if you want to comment maybe critical down below, we can share that. This is a tool that we use that people who worked at Fortune 500 companies haven't seen something this good. Like, it allows you to measure productivity, results, and that critical unit.
Yep. So and helps through the onboarding. Yeah. It's an amazing tool. And again, we talk a lot about like, what's your company's secret sauce? What's your critical unit? It bakes all of that into the onboarding and management of the team. Game changing. Like you said, I mean, I share this with people offline. They're wowed by it. So it's really, really good.
Comment down below. That's what we got. Again, this is my favorite topic, and we will do many more live streams on this. But thanks for sticking around with us, and we will see you next week.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.